This lesson describes the business cycle. The business cycle represents the challenge in terms of the overall economy that macroeconomists study and seek to understand. Now, if you take a look at what we're graphing, on the y-axis we're looking at aggregate output, which means we're going to add up everything produced within an economy within a given period of time. And what we're going to calculate is the total market value of production. So we're going to add up everything, for example, produced in the US economy in the year 2013 and figure out that the total value is, for example, $14 trillion. We've developed a system to measure this total market value that you're going to learn a lot more about, which is called GDP. So I'm going to be using the term GDP and total market value of production interchangeably for the remainder of this lesson. And we're looking at this total market value of production, and we're comparing it on the x-axis with time. So really what we're trying to understand is what's happening to the overall economy, what's happening to the total market value of production over time. And when macroeconomists have studied this, they've identified that there's this phenomenon called the business cycle. And inevitably, no matter what economy we study, we find that there are periods where the economy is growing, where the total market value of production is increasing. We're going to call these periods a period of expansion, when the total market value of production is increasing. Now, eventually we reach a peak, which is the maximum extent of this increase in the market value of production. Followed by this peak, we enter a period when GDP, or the total market value of production, is actually declining. We're going to call that a recession. Eventually, we reach a bottom point of this recession, of this decline in the market value of production, that we're going to call a trough. After the trough, we re-enter an expansion. So if you think about what we're saying that inevitably economies go through expansion, followed by recession, followed by expansion, followed by recession, followed by, I don't even remember where I ended, ad nauseum. It just keeps going through this cycle. Now, what is interesting and important to note is that if we look at the overall trend is that economies are growing over time. But what's important to realize is they're not growing consistently or steadily. Instead, at times of expansion, the economy is growing and the market value of production is increasing. But then the market value of production actually is declining during recessions. Now, overall, the extent of the expansions is greater than the extent of the recession, such that there's this overall upward growth in the economy over time. But the business cycle, this challenge of how do we deal with this inevitable cycle that the economy goes through, is something that macroeconomists are very interested in and fundamentally try to understand. Now, we can actually show that this business cycle describes the last, or not the last, but 50 years of economic history here in the United States between 1910 and 1960. Because what we're looking at here, again, this is for the United States, is on the x-axis again, time, what happened to the overall economy between 1910 and 1960. On the y-axis, again, we're looking at GDP, or the total market value of production. And what I think is going to be very clear is that initially, all right, we were in an expansion, which was followed by a recession, that was followed by an expansion, that was followed by a recession, that was followed by an expansion. And we could keep graphing and showing that the business cycle described how the economy developed in the United States during this time period. I want to draw your attention to a particularly profound expansion that happened in the 1920s. Now, some of you may have remembered studying the 1920s in your US history class last year. The 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, a time period when the automobile was introduced and produced here in the United States, a period of really profound economic growth when GDP increased rapidly. In 1929, though, we had the stock market crash, and we entered a particularly severe recession through the early 1930s. This recession is oftentimes referred to as the Great Depression. And we're going to talk a lot more about what that term, the Great Depression, means and why we refer to it in a way that's different than how we refer to all other recessions that we've experienced. But for the time being, I hope you can see that overall, during this time period, the trend was of economic growth in the United States, and in fact, really impressive economic growth. The value of production increased tremendously. However, this growth was not achieved consistently or steadily. We had expansions followed by recessions. We had to go through this inevitable business cycle time after time after again. Also notice that not all expansions and recessions last the same amount of time, are of the same magnitude. Some expansions last longer or are more profound. Other recessions are very short in duration. So it does depend, but that fundamental idea of expansion followed by recession followed by expansion, I think you can see very clearly through this data. Now, one other thing to think about is, well, what happens when we enter a recession? How come this is a term that probably all of us have heard of and are familiar with? And generally, we think of recessions as inflicting a lot of suffering, a lot of pain on societies, and maybe during 2008 and 2009, when we last entered a recession, you firsthand witnessed some of the effects of a recession on someone you knew, on a family member. But generally speaking, macroeconomists have established that there is a relationship between unemployment and GDP that I think really speaks to one of the primary negative effects of a recession. So if we take a look at what happened between 1929 and 1933, this time period that we just mentioned, historians have described as a Great Depression, I want us to think about what is the relationship between GDP and unemployment. And in a second, I'm going to ask you to hit pause and answer that question in your own words. But hopefully, you can remember that during this time period, the total market value of production, GDP, was declining. And what that means is we were producing fewer things of less value. Now, if we're going to be producing fewer things of less value, we need fewer workers. And if we need fewer workers, that means there are going to be more people who are unemployed, more people who can't find a job. And that's why we describe this relationship between GDP and unemployment as an inverse relationship. So I want you, in your own words, to describe why there is an inverse relationship between GDP and unemployment. Please hit pause. Hopefully, you wrote about the idea of how if there's an expansion, we're producing things of more value. And if we're producing things of more value, we need more people involved in production, which means more jobs and a reduction of unemployment. So that would be the situation where GDP is increasing and thus unemployment is decreasing, that inverse relationship we talked about. That concludes this lesson.